Good morning and welcome to Rethinking Freedom. I am your host, Aya Fubara Eneli, and today's show is unlike anything you've experienced yet on this show. So, we are going to be sharing with you the life and times and legacy of a civil rights icon that most of you probably have never heard of, and yet she was instrumental in all the arguments that led to the overthrow of of segregation on the Brown v. Board of Education case, to overthrowing Jim Crow, to women's rights, to LGBTQIA rights. She was a poet. She was a civil rights activist. She was an attorney. She is a writer. Gosh, what else did she do? She's a priest, so many first, and she's also a saint. Yes, she has been granted her sainthood, and her name is Pauli Murray. Pauli, last name Murray. And this is an episode that, whether you're listening to us on the radio station or on the podcast, you're downloading the podcast, or you're watching on our YouTube channel, you want to put this one on repeat. You want to go and get her books. Now, because of the length of the radio show, this was an interview that we actually did as part of a podcast called Women and Resistance. That's something that I and my co-host Adesoji Iginla do every week. So you want to check that out. It's on YouTube. It's under Adesoji Speaks Knowledge. But today with this radio show, this episode, this podcast segment, we're only going to be able to show a portion of that interview. You would have to go to Adesoji Speaks Knowledge to watch the entire thing. But I'm telling you, even what you get is going to blow your mind. I'm looking forward to hearing your comments and in the chat. If you just download or you listen to us on the radio station, please go to our YouTube channel, like, subscribe, and share, and leave a comment for us. It makes a huge difference in terms of our algorithms as well. And without further ado, I bring you me as Pauli Murray being interviewed by Adesoji Iginla. Enjoy.
And welcome to another episode of Women and Resistance. I am your co-host, Adesoji Iginla, and with me, as usual, is my sister from another mother, Aya Fubara Eneli Esquire. How are you, sister?
Pleased to be here.
Okay. Yes. Tonight we're going to be looking at another exceptional woman. They're all exceptional. Again, like I said, tonight we're going to be speaking about Pauli Murray. What is there to be said? Just initial thoughts. Pauli Murray was born in 1910 in Baltimore into will now be born into a multiracial family. And yes, she had a profound childhood. Could you give us an idea of who Pauli Murray was and what's made us want to talk to about her tonight?
In my younger years, I may have answered this question in a much different way. Um, it's a simple enough question, but as a woman of faith, it doesn't come so easily to me to answer that question in the fullness that it deserves.
Mm.
Suffice it to say that others, myself included on occasion, have described me as a poet, as a lawyer. Of course, I started as a daughter, a granddaughter, as a member of a family, a mixed family of both freed Blacks and Blacks who still had been in that tradition of slavery. A civil rights activist, a women's rights activist. Some may call me a champion for what in your day and age is now known as LGBTQIA. We did not have all of those, although I understand the sentiment behind it. And of course, a priest. When you said that I had a profound childhood, it evoked so many memories for me, some of which I captured in my memoir, Song in a Weary Throat, subtitled An American Pilgrimage. And I recognize that there may be some today who might question my decision to become a priest after the life that I will shortly share with you, or even my steadfastness to this idea of being an American, even as I was deeply aware of the flaws and the injustices of this country called the United States of America. And perhaps that could be a conversation of another day. There are people who are more recently writing about me. I, for many decades, was a forgotten hero. And yet, as we will go through, there is probably not an aspect of the rights that any non white, any woman, and even workers enjoy today that I did not play a role in, and certainly um, paved the way for any rights that members of the LGBTQIA community currently enjoy, which we know is under assault. As you said, I was born November 20th, 1910. My birth name was Anna Pauline Murray. And my Aunt Pauline, whom I came to live with when I was just 3 years old, I used to visit with her. She lived in Durham, North Carolina, and my family lived in Baltimore, Maryland. I was one of six children, but when I was three, my mother died of a brain hemorrhage, and me and my siblings and I, we were farmed out to different family members. And Aunt Pauline came up to visit, and she asked if I would rather go with my siblings or go with her. And as a 3 year old, I chose to go with Aunt Pauline. I have not written about my siblings. I really don't know much of what became of them. My father, shortly afterwards, was committed to an asylum. And when I was 12 years old, and as I say this, I had thought that I was past this part in my life, but I've not told this story in a long time. But my father, when I was 12, was brutally beaten to death by a guard at the mental health institution where he was housed. I wish that that would be such a common story for Black people, whom I did not call Black during my time. I used the term Negro. That was to create issues for me many decades later when I was a professor at Brandeis University. And when the young people were agitating for Black power and Black rights and civil rights, all of which they were not even aware that I was a pioneer of to some degree in terms of the legal fight. And because I continue to use the term Negro as opposed to Black, I suppose many of them taught me outdated and maybe not even for the cause, which
Mm.
is a cautionary tale for all of us. Because when we don't effectively study what came before, we may not really understand what is right in front of
In front
us.
of us. Yeah.
Yes, so my mother passed away when I was three, and my mother was Agnes Fitzgerald Murray, and my father was William H. Murray. They were both educated. And in Baltimore, we had access to schools, even though they were segregated schools. But my father supposedly developed severe mental illness. Some folks say it was severe depression or some psychosis. He was committed to Crownsville State Hospital, the Maryland State Hospital for the Negro Insane. And like I said, in 1923, he was brutally beaten to death by um, a hospital guard who I suppose was there to protect him and take care of him. I was raised by my aunt, Pauline Fitzgerald Dame, in Durham, North Carolina. It is my understanding that several of my siblings were institutionalized at some point, and I too frequently was hospitalized and also in mental institutions, sometimes just because of my very poor health. Poverty was something that I became very well acquainted with, but also maybe my constitution, given my family, and also some may speculate, given the fact that I was born in a woman's body, but felt like a man. I was drawn to and attracted to women whom I was forbidden to love. And I guess some may make the observation that I was particularly attracted to white women, whom I never in my letters necessarily claimed to be in a sexual relationship with, but I certainly had very close relationships with some. I'm of mixed race, if you want to call it identity. there's Irish, there's Native American, there's obviously African. Um, and interestingly enough, as the story unfolds, I can trace my lineage, as can many African Americans, that terminology used now, but back then, as could many Negroes, to our enslavers, to a white slave owner whose two sons raped my grandmother. I was a precocious young girl. My aunt Pauline called me her boy girl. I preferred boy clothes. I felt that they were more comfortable, but we did have a compromise that every Sunday when we went to church, I would dress up in a dress. I was on the debate team in the little school that we had for African Americans, Negroes at the time. I played sports. I was very athletic. Um, I was very smart, always had been brilliant, a really great student. And when I graduated high school from Hillsdale High School in Durham, North Carolina at age 16, I was actually offered a scholarship to attend Wilberforce College, a Negro college, and that scholarship was made possible by my community. But I turned down that scholarship.
Why?
I turned it down because I was tired of the segregation. As a matter of fact, as a young girl, boy girl, as my Aunt Pauline would call me, I refused to go to the movie theaters because they were segregated, and I was not going to pay money to sit in a segregated place. I would take my bicycle and I would walk everywhere because I did not want to ride the buses with their segregation. And I did not want to go to a college for Negroes. And so instead, I applied to Columbia University, and Columbia University turned me down for being female. I then applied to Hunter College in New York
York.
because Hunter College accepted Negroes, but I actually had an issue because the schools in North Carolina, the School for Negroes, we actually stopped at the 11th grade. And so I did not have all the coursework that I needed to get into Hunter College to begin studies there. And so I attended a school in New York. I lived with another family member just so that I could get the additional credits and then, of course, prove residency to be able to attend Hunter's College. I attended Hunter's College and I graduated one of four Negroes in my class in 1933, and I got my Bachelor of Arts degree in English. Now, my grandfather, Pa Fitzgerald, had always, who himself was an educator and who had left the North after the Civil War to come back to the South and started teaching. And he started in this makeshift shack where they would pull logs in from the woods for the children to sit on. It was quite pitiful. But he had always impressed upon me the importance of education. And of course, my parents themselves were educated. And there was this idea that if you got an education, then the doors of life opened up to you. But I graduated in 1933, and that was during the era of the Great Depression. And there was no work for my kind. There was no work for most kinds, but definitely no work for my kind. I was hungry. I was desperate. And I remember sitting in the office where you go to sign up for welfare, begging the government for some meager anything for me to be able to eat, and sitting there and watching all the other people in misery. And I would write, I would type. Here is a little excerpt from a book written about me by my great niece, Rosita Stevens Halsey, Pauli Murray, The Life of a Pioneering Feminist and Civil Rights Activist. And she wrote, Pauli found herself unemployed. Without the prospects of graduate school, she was forced to apply for public assistance, welfare. Sitting on hard benches at government offices, waiting like cattle reduced to a number, made Pauli's fingers burn again. Around her, the faces of America, dark and light, immigrant and indigenous, pleaded for work, not for a handout, but for work so they could eat and have a roof over their heads and perhaps a little dignity. And she quotes from a poem I wrote. Why did it have to be that way? Freedom is a dream, hunting as amber wine, or worlds remembered out of time. Not Eden's gates, but freedom lures us down a trail of skulls, where men forever crush the dreamers, never the dream. Would you like me to go on?
Go on. Could you
Go ahead.
elaborate on how you? I mean, I'm sure you're going to come to it, but you mentioned the clergy. What's led you to the clergy?
Yes, of course, the clergy was, if you would, the last quarter of my life. But perhaps I can read something from a combination. This is a compilation of my sermons and speeches on justice and transformation, called to speak a defiant word. And let me read from here to answer the question you asked in just a little way.
Because I'm minded to ask the question because it's not often a path that one treads, but there has to be a lead up to it.
Let me start off by saying I lived in the in-between. And so with one part of my family, I would be admonished not to go outside and play in the sun. I would be admonished to put cream to protect my skin so I didn't get any darker. And another side of my family that felt I was too light. And when I would go out to the schools, being bullied by many of the Negroes who were much darker than I was, who had an issue with the color of my skin and the texture of my hair. I lived racially in between. I lived in terms of gender in between. In terms of civil rights, here we were fighting against Jim Crow, against the racism against Black people, against Negroes, only for me to finally get into Howard University and now face Jane Crow, not just from white people, but actually from the Black men and who were my peers and from the Black male professors. Of course, there were only male professors who would openly taunt me for coming to law school and taking up a seat that a man should have had, a Black man should have had. So at what point am I embraced as Black, but then put back as a woman? At what point am I embraced as a woman, but then held back as Black? And my whole life, I lived in the in-between, never fully accepted as who I am, who I felt myself to be. Doors after doors after doors shut in my face, and I will share with you some of them. And so you may understand why I then wrote this or stated this in one of my sermons. Here, then, is the challenge and the promise of the Christian message. But am I willing to accept it? Give me a second, please. Am I willing to relinquish my self-interest, my self-centeredness, my dependence upon my own resources or upon others, and retire my entire will, my entire life to God? Am I willing to trust in God absolutely and without any reservations? Am I prepared to acknowledge that all I am and all that I have belong to my Creator, and that I am not here for my own purposes, my own glory, but for the purposes and glory of God? I don't know. Some may read this and they may say that just as it has been stated that religion is the opium of the masses, that perhaps I got to a place of such deep pain, a place where I could never find where I fit in just as I was, and that I got to a place where I returned to the roots of my Aunt Pauline and my grandmothers and all the women who found solace in Christianity, and that I returned to those roots to make peace of a world that would not make peace with me.
Okay.
Maybe I was tired of fighting, although I never really stopped. But at some point, some might say, I decided perhaps it was time to surrender to my Creator because I had done all that I knew to do. And I fought all the time. My whole life, I feel, was a fight. So here I am. I get into Hunter College. I graduate from Hunter College. Still no respect. Still fighting. Still looking for a job. I worked for the WPA. Attended various workshops, adult education courses, and community programs during the Great Depression. Just anything at all that I could find to make a way, to make a life. I met a friend. She was a white girl. She was the daughter of a banker. I don't know that it was cosplay, but me being where I was in the camp that I had been sent to because I was so malnourished that the doctor said, after I had finally, as a graduate, gotten a job as someone just answering phone calls at Hunter College, but I was the first Black person hired in that position and hired in that capacity because all the rest of the Black people, if they did get hired, were hired as janitors. I was grateful for that, but not enough to feed on. And finally, so malnourished and sick, and the doctor said, you have got to get to a place where you can eat properly. And to be able to get the assistance that I needed, I could not have that job. So I quit that job, and that allowed me to then be recommended to a place called Camp Terra. It was a place where they provided some food, some sustenance for people during this Depression era. And that's where I met my friend Peggy. And then we ended up, after I got kicked out of Camp Terra because they found a copy of a Karl Marx book in my room and decided I was a communist, we actually went on a 5-week hiking, camping just out there on our own. And when I was in California, I got news that my Aunt Pauline was sick and I needed to return to Durham, North Carolina. How do you do that with no resources? Well, I'll tell you what I did. I wrote a poem about it, 10,000 miles on a dime. And I was dressed like a boy. And what we would do is we would jump on freight trains and sleep wherever we could on the trains with cattle, with food, with whatever was being transported. And you jump off and you get on another train and you work somewhere and you try to get a little food to eat. And that is how I got all the way back to Durham, North Carolina from California. And fortunately, my Aunt Pauline wasn't doing so bad, and she did eventually recover from that illness. But while I was there was a case that came about where it was decided that, they could not discriminate against Black people anymore getting into colleges. At least so I thought. And so I decided to apply to the University of North Carolina, a place that by birth I should have been ushered into because the white side of my family, the ones who had raped my grandmother, were benefactors and trustees of that university. So I should have been a legacy admit, like the white people get admitted. But there was not one Black student at that school. But I applied nonetheless. And then I got the rejection letter. I could not be admitted because of my race. I tried to fight it. And I wrote a letter to President Roosevelt and to his wife, especially after he had the gall to come down to the university and accept an honorary degree. And in his remarks, talked about how all Americans should have this liberal education. Well, then why are you closing the doors to me? He never responded to me, but his wife, Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, did. And we continued this correspondence, and she became a close friend of mine, even though we sometimes did not agree. Did I tell you about the time? 14 years before Rosa Parks, I got arrested for refusing to move on a bus. I was traveling with a friend of mine. I gave my name when I was arrested as Oliver. They thought I was male. Some say that throughout my life, and my letters do bear this out to some degree, that I had different aliases. But they were very smart in how they went about it, because once the pressure started to be put on them, we were locked up. And I wrote to them and said, I need toilet paper. I need toiletries because there are things here, the bed bugs. And I always spoke up. They didn't know what quite to do with me. But the WPA did pay to get us, to bail us out. And once they knew that there was this much interest in that particular case, they dropped the part that had to do with not sitting in the colored section and instead just maintain the charge of disorderly conduct, disturbing the peace. And on that, they had us, and we had to pay a fine. But when I reached out to the NAACP, when I was denied admission to University of North Carolina, I wanted them to take up my case. That was when I first made acquaintance with Thurgood Marshall, the famed Thurgood Marshall,
Yeah.
who informed me that they could not take up my case. He, at the time, tried to put more emphasis on the fact that technically, since I had not lived in North Carolina for a while, that I was not a resident of the state, and therefore I could be denied on those grounds. But really, I think that what he alluded to was that the NAACP, well, he stated and then alluded to more, but that the NAACP is very careful about what kind of cases they take on what kinds of people they represent, because they have to look into your person carefully. It's for the same reason that Claudette Colvin was not an ideal candidate for her case to be taken up in terms of refusing to sit in the segregated portion of the bus. She was young and she got pregnant, out of wedlock. And he did not give any further information, but I think that I was not quite the ideal candidate. I was disappointed. It felt very crushing to me. Here I was, a graduate, trying to find a way to make a way in life, and doors just kept getting shut. But I started this letter writing campaign, and the newspapers did pick up the story. And my Aunt Pauline and my family were very concerned that I was taking up this fight, because there were still people being lynched. And their concern was that if people found out that the Negro causing this ruckus was their child or was part of their family, my Aunt Pauline was concerned her house would be burnt down. She was also concerned that she would be dismissed from her job, and she was an elderly woman and she did not have a pension. And what would happen to her if such a thing happened? And so when you look at people and you look at the fights that they wage and the ones that they don't be so harsh and don't be so quick to arrive at conclusions, because you don't know all that goes into a decision to stand down or to keep fighting. And sometimes that decision has a lot more to do with your loved ones, because the repercussions for your actions don't just impact you. They may have an impact on others, collateral damage, if you will. But I always had a relationship with my typewriter. I wrote essays and articles on race and poverty and inequality. My activism was definitely underway. And so I did get a job, and I was fighting with, I pause. I pause as I recall the violent death of my father. I pause as I recall the violent death of yet another young man who had been accused of raping. No, he had been accused, my apologies. He had been accused of killing a white man. He was a sharecropper, and he had demanded his wages. And the white landowner had refused to pay him his wages. And at some point, he thought the white landowner was going for his gun. And so he pulled his out and shot the white landowner. He claimed self-defense. And at his trial, which should have been a trial of his peers, a trial by a jury of his peers, he was convicted and sentenced to death by the peers of the person he was accused of killing. They were all landowners who had sharecroppers on their land, and there was one banker on the jury, and of course, all white males. And I began a campaign on behalf of this man's life, fighting for his life. We were trying to raise money for his defense. And I would have programs with his mother in the community, bringing awareness, trying to raise money. And we did raise a significant amount of money for his appeal, thousands of dollars back then. But of course, it was for naught. He was still sentenced to death. He was still killed. And it was during that process that I realized if I really wanted to fight, if I really wanted to make a difference for my people, I needed a law degree. And I was recommended by Mr. Ransom to the Howard University School of Law. And at the time that I was admitted for my class, I was the only female. There was later another woman who was admitted, but she shortly thereafter quit for reasons that I would leave up to the imagination of your listeners. But I would say this: professors and students alike, all Black men, would exclude me. There was a memo sent out by the dean inviting the brightest students to his home because that was where they would look over the students that they would ultimately admit to the legal fraternity. And I was excluded. And when I questioned them why, because I was a great student, I was told that I could not be included due to my gender. I had never really felt the sting of sexism until I came to Howard University College of Law. And I made up my mind to show them who I was. And I was the top student in my class. Now, it was tradition that if you are the top student, you get the highest grades, that you are appointed Chief Justice for your class, for the school.
Mm-hmm.
And these men, Black men, fighting against Jim Crow, initially skirted the issue and chose not to have the usual process to appoint and the Chief Justice. Still, I fought on, being excellent in all my grades. For our senior thesis, we all had to choose topics, and I chose to focus on the 14th Amendment and how, rather than emphasizing the equal part of the argument, separate and equal. Plessy versus Ferguson, it said segregation was okay as long as it was separate and equal. So as long as it was equal. And so Black legal scholars had been focusing only on let's make it equal. And I said, actually, the fact that it's separate in the first place is a violation of the 14th Amendment. And they thought I was crazy. And my professor said, that is just not going to fly. You really are going to write about that? Yes, I am. And I bet him that in 25 years, the law would change and they would recognize that the separate portion of that Plessy versus Ferguson was against the Constitution. It was unconstitutional. Well, that actually happened in 1954 with the Brown v. Board of Education. And now here's the funny thing about erasure. Thurgood Marshall himself told me that my paper, that senior thesis, that was so ridiculed while I was in law school, became the bedrock, that there were salient arguments in it that became a major part of the arguments they laid out in Brown v. Board of Education that overturned segregation laws. But nowhere in that brief was my name included. And when they took their victory lap, when they stood on the court steps and took their pictures, I was not invited. I was not even mentioned. By the way, that professor, there was a bet. It was $10, I think. I don't know that he ever paid me my money. And it would go on. So finally, being the top student in terms of all my scores at Howard University, at the College of Law, they finally did, my Black brothers, acquiesce and recognize me as Chief Justice. Now, back in those days, the top student from Howard College of Law would get a scholarship to attend Harvard University to advance their studies. So I applied This time I get a letter of rejection, not for my race, but for my gender. Harvard University did not admit women at that time, and certainly not into that program. And I was the one who coined Jane Crow. Here I am with a law degree and still doors being shut to me. I ultimately, after being denied admission to Harvard University, I ultimately applied to and was accepted at the University of California, Berkeley, which is where I got my LLM, my Master's of Law, in 1945. Still struggling to find a place to fit in, to find work, to be accepted. I did eventually work with Paul Weiss. I had an opportunity to meet one of the loves of my life. I would say maybe the greatest love of my life in terms of an intimate partner, Renee Barlow, who was my close companion. I once proposed marriage to a man named Roy Wynn during a period of emotional struggle, just trying to again fit in, make my way in the world. But that engagement ended. In the 1930s, I did write and repeatedly seek assistance from physicians. I wanted them to check me out, to conduct tests, to find out if perhaps I was what is popularly known as a hermaphrodite, whether I actually had male genitalia that just had not descended. And to my dismay, I was told repeatedly that I didn't. I did ask for hormone therapy back then in the 1930s and was rejected.
Wow.
I had an opportunity to travel to Ghana, and I worked in Ghana teaching constitutional law, observing the transition at the time from colonialism to quote unquote independence.
Yeah.
But again, feeling the sting of rejection and seeing what happens even when people who look like you are not about justice, because I came to see how neocolonialism was taking root and how many of the leaders were actually not looking out for the interests of their people and rather for theirs. I did get a job with Paul Weiss law firm. It's a firm that is still in existence today. And that was probably the most money I had ever made in my life. That also happens to be where I met Renee Barlow. And I would credit Weiss as pivotal in solidifying my legal and philosophical thinking. And even in that role, understanding how to use the law to fight for freedom, to fight for justice. Ultimately, I'm just going to touch on this really quickly. We'll come back to it if you have any further questions. After the death of Renee, after being in and out of mental institutions and hospitals throughout my life, I was quite a small frame. I pursued a doctorate at Yale Law School, becoming the first Black person to receive Yale's highest law degree. I got my Doctor of Jurisprudence there. And that was in 1965. So at this time, I'm a 55-year-old woman. And then I went on years later to divinity school, to the General Theological Seminary, where I also received a Master's of Divinity in 1976. And in 1976, the Episcopalian Church finally decided that women could become ordained priests. And in 1977, I was ordained as a priest, and I was the first Negro woman to achieve that. Some of the things that you might want to know about me, there's so much that I could share with you. I truly encourage all of your listeners to engage me from whatever perspective they choose. As a civil rights leader, as a women's rights leader, as a poet. I was a prolific poet, and I had my poetry published back in the 30s to begin with, in anthologies that even included people like Langston Hughes, who was a personal friend of mine. When I graduated from Howard Law School, Eleanor Roosevelt actually sent me a bouquet of flowers, and I kept the ribbon. And that ribbon was part of my rituals when I was ordained as a priest. I will tell you more about that. But you can come at me from a social work perspective, because I did work with sharecroppers and again, trying to help people just be able to live with dignity.
Sure.
You can come at me from an academic perspective. I was a professor. I taught at Brandeis University. I fought to become a tenured professor. When I applied for tenure, because I was an old woman, and again, in a very precarious financial situation, and I needed something more solid. And I applied for tenure, and I was initially denied. They said, some of you may have heard the Publish or Perish, and they said my work was not quite up
for peer review.
Yes. Even though, as at that time, even Ruth Bader Ginsburg had credited me with the legal philosophy and the brief that she based her arguments on to fight for women's rights. And so today, everybody knows about Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the United States of America, but she credited me for the work she was then able to do, which catapulted her into the stratosphere that she got into, and then became the Supreme Court justice that she was. So you can come at me from there. You can come at me as the first African American to earn a JSD from Yale. You can come at me from being the ordained to Episcopal priest, and of course, again, the first Negro, they say Black African American priest in the Episcopalian Church. You can come at me for being a co-founder, or come to me, I shouldn't say at me, come to me for being a co-founder of the National Organization of Women in 1966.
No.
Or for being an early advocate for including sex discrimination in Title VII of the 1964 Civil Acts right. Or being one of the people who chewed Bayard Rustin's head off for daring to have that march on Washington and have all of those speakers and not have a woman on that podium as a speaker. Yes, we can sing, but we can do other things. And he knew better for sure. You can look at my involvement with the NAACP, with CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. I was a co-founder of CORE. Do you know that? You can look at me for being on the legal committee for the ACLU and the work that I did with the ACLU that still stands today. Of course, as so often happens, during my lifetime, I was largely overlooked. And even after I passed away from cancer. But one of the things I was determined to do in the latter parts of my life was to tell my story. And that is in that biography, my memoir that I shared with you earlier. Since then, there are lots of others who have started to write about me. There is a documentary that came out in 2021. My name is Pauli Murray. They did a decent job. I may have chosen some different people to speak about me, but I lived long enough to understand how these things go. The Yale Law School now has a Pauli Murray Fellowship that supports scholars working at the intersection of law, race, gender, and LGBTQI+ issues. Let's see if that stands. You know, when I think of all the things that I was involved in and all the things that I accomplished, there were times that I would be interviewed and people would say, oh my God, you know, you were so extraordinary and how did you get all of this done, and so on and so forth. And what I would tell them, for the most part, is that I was just persistent in my commitment. Nothing, like there wasn't some extraordinary chip embedded in me in that way. But I was consistent in my commitment. And so as you study my life, it is not to put me on a pedestal, although yes, I appreciate being acknowledged for what I did and the work that I did, but I know that I was put here for a purpose. And in my later years, as I read earlier, it was understanding that that purpose was beyond me, and it wasn't about being individualistic, but it's also about people understanding that if you are persistent in your commitment, you too will blaze your own trails. You too will open up doors for other people. You too can make a difference with this life that you've been given. And that is something that all of us should aim for. So I know that you have some other questions, which I will answer, but I do want to bring up some of these to your listeners. This is another book that I wrote called Proud Shoes, The Story of an American Family. See the theme? My memoir, An American Pilgrimage. This one, The Story of an American Family. I guess one could state that it was important to me to be accepted, to fit in somewhere. And since America was where I was born, where I could trace my roots directly, although of course I understood I was of African descent as well.
Okay.
That was important. This is another book. I love this book because even a 10-year-old can read this book and understand and follow along with my life. Pauli Murray, Trailblazing Activist for Civil Rights, Women's Rights, and Human Rights by Jane A. Hewitt. Yes, this is definitely a book that I would recommend. I have another book here, and this is the one that I let you know my great niece was a co-author on. Pauli Murray, The Life of a Pioneering Feminist and Civil Rights Activist. Now, there's some people who may ask, in this day and age, would I consider myself transgender? What would my pronouns be? I think that we have to be careful about backtracking people into the present. I lived in a different time. And so since my transition, heard people refer to me as they, them. Some people still refer to me as she. Let me make it simple for all of you. Would you like me to do that?
Go on.
Just call me Pauli. Just call me Pauli. I actually came at Pauli, Anna Pauline, but I tried different variations and different names that I tried. And I like Pauli. Just call me Pauli. Pauli said so-and-so. You don't have to say they said so-and-so. Just call me by my name. And that way you do not have to infer something on me that you have no real reason to know. Maybe I would have gone by they, them.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I would have stayed she. I never claimed some of the things that are being attributed to me now, although of course the language did not exist then, but it's okay to just call me as I am. Today, I have honorary doctorates from multiple institutions. I have to tell this story.
Go on.
The University of North Carolina had the unmitigated gall to offer me an honorary degree while I was still living. Yes, thank you. Someone said I always would say, don't get mad, get smart. Yes, certainly still applies today. That's what I did everywhere I went. Everywhere I went to study, in every place that I worked. When discrimination came to slap me in the face, knock me down, punched me, kicked me in the gut, I would always say to myself, get smart. And that is why ultimately those men had to acknowledge my work and my genius. But I digress. The University of North Carolina now offered me a doctorate. Now that I had become someone worthy of being affiliated with their institution, would you like to hazard a guess as to whether I was so blown away by this gesture and went to collect my doctorate degree and forgive them for all of their past injustices? Do you think that that's what I did?
Of course, I mean, Black people are normally very forgiving. So one would expect you went in there or, hop stepping.
No, sir. No, sir. They don't get to use my name and to do these performative, meaningless things to whitewash their racism and their injustice. No, you don't get to just give me a degree and that makes up for what you did. No, I rejected their degree, as I should. And I hope even that is a lesson to those who may be watching and listening. I am a National Women's Hall of Fame inductee. Yale University did name a Pauli Murray College after me in 2017. I have been featured on a U.S. stamp in 2024. There is a Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice located in Durham, North Carolina, and it's actually in the home. It's housed in the building, the home where I lived with my grandpa Fitzgerald and my Aunt Pauline. I died on July 1st, 1985 of cancer, and I died in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. There was much debate on the campus and in the community, which led to my Aunt Pauline being very concerned. The governor of North Carolina made this statement. North Carolina does not believe in social equality between the races and will not tolerate mixed school for the races. He went on to say, there should be separate schools and graduate programs for Negroes. And the Negro president of the North Carolina College for Negroes, Dr. James E. Shepard, in response to the governor's remarks, stated this: Negroes could do their best work only in their own schools. I will not make I will not pass any judgment at this time on the comments of Dr. Shepard. I will say that I will assume that he meant well. I believe that those words that he wrote or he stated, depending on your lens,
can be seen
different in different ways.
Yeah.
Being true to my life, I would say that I would always fight for what we came to know as integration. In fact, when I was a student at Howard University, I helped to desegregate some restaurants. However, because Howard University then and now received quite a bit of its funding directly from Congress, a racist congressman met with Mordecai Johnson, the president of Howard, and said, you call off your students, like we were a pack of hound dogs, and stop this desegregation movement, or you tell them they will not have a school to graduate from because we will pull all their funding. And the president presented that to us, and we had to make a decision. Fight to be served at white-only counters, or have a school where we can get educated and get an education and get our degrees.
So what choice did you make?
We chose to get our degrees. I would always fight for our full humanity, for us to be seen in our wholeness. And yet, I wonder, as we fought to desegregate those white lunch counters and initially succeeded, and the white people then decided that they would no longer come to those establishments, we encouraged one another to buy lunch from those establishments so they could stay open. But in doing so, were we now not taking money
away from your economy,
from the
Black economy,
restaurants and the Black economy, yes, that had sustained us, the Negro establishments that had sustained us? So, something to ponder. I'm not saying I agree or disagree with him as much as I am encouraging your generation to do your work, because the same threats of funding that we faced are the threats you're facing right now, aren't you?
Very much so. Very much
Schools
so.
being told to bow down and to give up their moral and ethical standings just to keep their doors open. How will you respond? How will the church respond? I have an chapter where I write about the minorities within this Christianity, and to consider that so-called evangelicals make up the most strident part of the MAGA base should give one cause to ponder.
Yes.
And we don't want to highlight those kind of people. They might convince other people, inspire other people to be wayward. And to what extent are we in even the Negro, okay, your Black African American community, to what extent are we still marginalizing?
Mm.
Don't let anyone put any limitations on you. I never did. And that's why I lived such a full life, regardless of my struggles.
Yes.
Thank you for this time.
Speaking of, yes, thank you, thank you, thank you. And speaking of full lives, um, next week we're going to be looking at the lives and times of Lucille Parsons, another interesting person. The name again is Lucille Parsons.
Whom I
That'll be,
bet many of your listeners have never heard of.
yes, yes, I'm sure. But again, that's what this series aims to do. It's not just bring household names, but also names that will probably have gone unmentioned or unheard of, but then to bring them to the consciousness of people. So, again, thank you all for listening, watching, and for those who will come back and watch this, do like, share, and more importantly, leave comments in the comment section. That comments helps drive what we get to talk about, who we get to talk about here. You can even bring suggestions of names, put them in the comments, and just give us a general overview of what you think of the series so far. And so, until next week, sister, how?
Okay, first of all, I want to take this wig off and all of this stuff because it's really hot. I don't know how priests do it, but I'm glad I don't have to. No, I had to break character real quick. Hey, y'all, listen, we didn't even get to. There's so much about Pauli
Yeah,
Murray. I didn't even get
exactly.
into all the cases that she argued and the briefs that she wrote, and we didn't share. We only shared one of her poems. Phenomenal lady, and I cannot imagine the pain that she experienced trying to make her way in the world. And in addition to everything that I take from her life, it's just that we need to become passionate to one another. We
Yeah.
truly don't know what people are going through. And now with all this keyboard warrior stuff, it's so easy to tear people down, to make disparaging comments, to cast aspersions on people. We really need to be careful because we might really just be pushing people over the edge. And people who are well-meaning, people who really are trying to fight for all of us, even as they try to find their place in the world. So I can only imagine that if she lived during this time with all the social media stuff and people being able to just say anything they wanted to about you at any time, uh, I don't know. I hope that she would have had the fortitude to soldier on. But these are tough times out here, and let's be kind to one another. Yeah.
Yeah. So, on that very hopeful note, yes.
Thank you, Brother Adesoji. Well, I hope that you absolutely enjoyed just getting a little bit of information about who Pauli Murray was and the amazing, significant impact that she has had on all of us here in the United States of America and even beyond, because she also traveled to other countries and helped to teach other young lawyers. Interestingly enough, we're at a time when her legacy is being attacked and um, this threatened erasure, although we will never let that happen under the Trump white fascist regime, which is what it is, this dictatorship. The goal has basically been to erase Black and brown and women and LGBTQI people from the annals of history, certainly the federal government, and they're defunding everything that they can that in any way showcases the accomplishments of non-white nationalist heterosexual men. But we're going to keep fighting back. But the center named in honor of Pauli Murray, that's actually located in her family's home, is being threatened right now because the government is the white fascist, nationalist, fascist government is trying to pull their funding. But we know we're going to soldier on. So thank you for watching. Get the books, leave a comment. Please like, share, subscribe, and we look forward to seeing you next week.